The Spinoff Podcast Network.
K-pop to me means more than just listening to music. It's learning to be myself.
The Spinoff's new documentary, K-Pollies, follows 3 Pacific youth obsessed with K-pop. In a one-off documentary, see what they've found in Korean pop culture and how they bridge it with their own.
When you start dressing, looking different, everyone side-eyes you. But in K-pop, they're just like, no, like celebrate yourself.
Watch K-Pollies today at thespinoff.co.nz/videos. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. You're listening to Business is Boring, a podcast that reckons it's anything but. Business is Boring is brought to you by Spark Lab, offering inspiration and practical advice to help businesses find their edge. To hear more about Spark Lab, including details about the latest events, workshops and business tools, visit sparklab.co.nz. And now, here's your host, Simon Pound.
You're listening to Business is Boring, a podcast that reckons it's anything but. Business is Boring is made by the Spinoff with help from Callaghan Innovation, New Zealand's innovation agency. Here's your host, Simon Pound.
Today's guest started working in the tech sector 20 years ago, before many people knew New Zealand even had one. Coming from investment banking, first she founded Morel Co, an investment company to work with technology companies, and then Number 8 Ventures, the first US-style venture capital fund here. And on the side, our guest founded Morgo, a high-energy retreat and recharge for CEOs building tech or high-growth companies going global from New Zealand or Australia. To chat the journey, the industry today, and her experience, Jenny Morel joins us now. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Simon.
Hey, so tell me first up, what led you to start Morel Co, and then not long after Number 8 Ventures? What was the state of the local tech scene then?
Well, I guess, first of all, my background was in investment banking in the UK and in New Zealand. And for a while before I started Morel Co, I'd been sort of like doing freelance corporate finance, and I also had a number of company directorships, which sort of comes into the story later, I guess. And I decided I wanted to start my own business and not just sell my hours. The only thing I knew about was investment banking, so I started a small investment bank. And in the meantime, I'd fallen in love with technology. And initially that was actually biotechnology through having been on the board of AgResearch, the largest Crown Research Institute in New Zealand. And I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic to help some of these biotech spin-outs, get going? I soon found that actually it was a very small biotech market in New Zealand. But the characteristics of biotech companies are kind of shared by other tech companies. They're based on IP. IP crosses boundaries really easily. So if you're not going to do it here, it'll be picked up somewhere else in the world. They can scale very, very fast, but they need money to do that. And the money is very hard to raise because they have intellectual property which is intangible. So all of these these characteristics were, well, why stop at biotech? And then really our market research before starting, or my market research before starting Morel Co, was anecdotal. As a friend saying from a multinational, I wanted to buy this company and they couldn't get an advisor, so the negotiations were kind of difficult. And I'm thinking, oh, really? No advisor for the tech company that's getting bought? That's wrong. And, there was really just anecdotal. And so I thought it would be fun. I did not have great market research. I just thought it would be fun. And I thought I would hire one other person to do it with me initially. But instead I found a good senior deal doer and a really good junior guy. So we set out with 3 executives and 1 support person. And we had a lot of fun. I mean, it was amazing. We started building then a database of the New Zealand technology the New Zealand technology industry. And at the end of the first year, we had 600 companies on that database. I'm like, wow, we never knew. We didn't know there were that many companies out there. We were just finding them. And a lot of them were small and just local. But we started doing studies of different sectors, like knowledge management companies back then. That's when I met Catherine Corrich of Sistock, who was building one of those. So that was sort of fascinating. And we were trying for completeness. We wanted to get every company into the database. We had to give up that idea. At the end of the second year, we had 2,000 companies on the database. So then we were just excited, that they keep on coming.
That's remarkable. And how soon into kind of that journey of working with those companies was the need for capital and the kind of capital that understood the timelines and the investing ahead of revenue and the difficulty of tech companies or research or research companies needing to have patents in the work? Like, was there kind of the capital market and the support around for companies like that?
And there still isn't. So, obviously it's improved enormously. When we set out with Number 8 with Morel Co, I said that we weren't going to have a venture capital fund. And actually at the same time, Caltech was starting a small fund. And I gave them an investment, actually, thinking this was good. We'd have an ecosystem of doing all sorts of things. And in that first year of Morel Co, we raised money for 3 companies, but it's horrible business, this raising money. We're putting our friends into these young companies. And you learn very quickly that all the investors need a portfolio. So you love each one when you invest in it, but not all of them are going to succeed. So the investors should always have a portfolio. The companies all wanted help as much as they wanted money. So my senior deal doer got 20% of his time sucked out the first year in free advice for one company. And that's it's an interesting staff training exercise, but it's not a viable business model. So we're like, no, we're not going to do this. We actually made money by selling companies mostly, but we also did some company restructurings and we designed the first, kind of US style employee option scheme in New Zealand and helped people implement that, help people streamline, what they were doing, and we helped major negotiations. So we did other things apart from the capital raising. But it was really 1 year later, I was lying on the beach in January. I had a friend from the US who actually is very relevant to the story, Don Campbell, who then was running something called Hamburg & Quist Guarantee Finance, kind of venture lending. And Don had said, Jenny, you got to get yourself a fund. So in January I go, Don was right. We've got to do a fund. And really to get these things right, that the investors had a portfolio, you were actually being paid something to get involved and give advice to the companies within the structure. And also you had access to follow-on funding because every time a company wanted to raise more money, it's a kind of a 6-month stop the company event. So we wanted to fix some of those things. And that was the beginning of Number 8 Ventures.
And even today, after the whole kind of venture capital and funded company thing has become mythologized and this whole investing in head of growth is so well understood, people still ask questions like, why aren't these companies profitable? And what are you doing investing in unprofitable companies? How much education was there in the beginning, trying to get people behind you and try to get kind of the companies to operate the right way?
Actually, I thought the most interesting word you said then was mythology. And there still is a lot of mythology in New Zealand about what venture capital is. It's amazing how many experts there are in venture capital compared with how little venture capital there is in New Zealand. And so that's a real mismatch. But going back to when we were started Morel Co, or then when I started the venture fund, there was a complete lack of awareness about the tech sector in New Zealand. Even more irritatingly, people would talk about how we ought to build one. And I would say, but it's there. Go help it. And that's something that really annoys me. I like to back people who are already underway doing something. And the people who talk about what ought to be should do the same. They should get in and work with people who are doing it, not think about if they want to create something new, but do it, do it, don't talk about it. And I very much saw our role in both those companies as getting behind the people who are already doing. But I can remember, it must have been when I was setting up Number 8 Ventures, talking to Wellington Rotary about the New Zealand tech sector. They thought I was very sweet. They were sort of cute. I don't feel cute at all, incidentally. But they were all these, sort of grins on their face. And then so this is something that happens in garages. And I have nothing against garages. Some of the greatest companies have come out of garages. So Hewlett-Packard, Apple, there's a great history of garages. But really, we were talking past each other. There was no point of connection. I remember that feeling very strongly, just thinking I'm trying really hard to communicate. And they just, because they come from a place where they don't think it exists, and technology for people in New Zealand was something that you got from overseas and used, not something you created here. There were people creating it, right? But they were isolated.
How did you go about getting the funds to support these companies? And I mean, one of the kind of what seems to be one of the truisms of capital is there's always more needed as well.
Well, it's always very, very hard to raise money. And it's hard for companies, and it's also hard for venture capital funds, and they should understand that. And anybody who's gone through that fundraising journey, and I've talked to a lot of them, I mean, sure, you can get lucky, but, it takes a good 6 months, and you will get a lot of rejections, and you need kind of rhinoceros hide. But and it's a lot of it is through, well, I think sort of high quality networking, networking with intent. So I'm very keen on what networking can do for you. But I don't mean just going to parties. I mean doing it in some deliberative sort of manner. And going back to when I started Number 8 Ventures, well, first of all, I emailed this guy, Don, was American, and said, hey, Don, you were right. I need a fund. And his background was that he and a partner, Dan Case, had built a venture lending business which got bought by Hambrecht & Quist, which was then the investment bank in Silicon Valley. It's now part of JP Morgan. And his business partner, Dan, ended up as CEO of Hambrecht & Quist. The relevance of this is that his old partner, Don, my friend, got to invest Hambrecht & Quist's capital. And one of the things that he decided to invest in was New Zealand forests, right? It's a very odd segue, right? And he set up an investment trust in London to invest in New Zealand. So Don was spending a bit of time in New Zealand, which is how I met him. And he then said to me, this is great, you can do a fund. He said, how would you like to do a joint venture with Hambrecht & Quist? And it was just extraordinary because it was like the name, right? So I went up to San Francisco to do this deal, and I walked out on it in the first morning, so, which was certainly a surprise to me. And the reason for that is that we were not aligned in what we're doing. And if you're going into a joint venture, there has to be alignment. And they were really looking to invest in 2 or 3 pre-NASDAQ listing companies. And I knew the New Zealand deal flow, and that was not what I was seeing. But also, I was going to bring investors into this fund who needed a broader portfolio than that, whereas they had a portfolio of funds. So that was important. And then I guess, and this is what all entrepreneurs do, you have to pick yourself up again. And I thought, well, I've got the whole week in San Francisco. What's next? Now, venture capitalists are very hard to meet. They're very busy people. But luckily, there was one venture capitalist I'd met twice, so I knew him really well, compared with any other venture capitalist. And I rang him up and said, I came up here to do this joint venture, which you're not going to do, but, I really don't know how to get started. And he said, you better come out and talk to me, 6 o'clock tonight. So grab a rental car out to Silicon Valley. And then he talked me through it, and he said, don't partner with anybody up here, because anybody who's any good is so busy doing what they're doing, they don't really have time to partner with you. And he got rid of all my arguments, except for one. I said, I don't actually know how to do this, so I need a mentor. And he introduced me to Pitch Johnson, who was one of the founders of venture capital in Silicon Valley. And Pitch became my coach for establishing Number 8 Ventures and an investor.
That's so cool. What was the journey like with Number 8 Ventures? Because by the time it was up and running, you were heading straight headlong into the GFC.
Oh, well, that was a little way away. But yeah, the GFC was absolutely brutal. And so maybe we'll come back to that and just touch on the other, the next business that I started, which was Morgo, having sort of rather painfully got the first Number 8 Ventures fund raised and underway before VIF, going back before that. I needed somebody else to run the investment bank. Like running two businesses was too much. And my good deal doer wanted to do it to begin with, but he didn't like doing staff and admin and marketing and a few other things. So we brought in an outside chief executive. And the first year we had Morel Co, we had 12 clients and we took them all away for a 2-day retreat weekend. And it was just fantastic. Sharing stories. They're all in quite different industries, but they have all these common experiences, especially how hard it is being offshore doing business. So I'd known that we should do this and we should do it bigger, but hadn't had the energy. I had a new CEO coming into Morel Co, and I said, look, I'll give you this welcome gift. I'll organise this get-together of all these tech companies that I know we should do, because we knew a lot of them who didn't know each other. So I'd say, but you're talking about a development centre in Poland. These guys have already done one. Or you're talking about doing business with the US military. These guys have just gone through the whole GSA process and they've got a really good consultant in Washington. You should be talking. And so we did our first Morgo. It was about maybe 2 or 3 years after it started, Number 8 Ventures. And we brought together for that first one, 80 people at Wairaki. And it was just fantastic. It was, the energy in the room was unbelievable. So that's where Morgo started from. And about 2 years after that, maybe 3 years after that, decided to close down the investment bank because the guy running it I had a good deal doer doing it, but he didn't like the actual running it. And it's like, I'm doing too much. I want to just focus on Number 8 Ventures. So unless you're going to really, step up and do the whole thing, we're just going to let it go. So we decided to close Morel Co. People said, but you can't close Morgo. And I said, well, I can. Just watch me. And then I said, I'll do one more. And a year later, it's like, I'll do one more. And then I thought, this thing's got a life of its own, and I'm doing it because it actually gives me a recharge as well as them. So while it was a lot of work to get it together, I always felt great afterwards. So we kept Morgo going on the side of Number 8 Ventures.
What kind of stuff happens at Morgo, and what's changed there over the years? And how do you describe it? Like a retreat for C-level executives? What's that mean?
We really struggle with how to describe Morgo. And I've challenged a number of marketing people to help me out on this one. The best we've done is the tagline, which is courtesy of Andy Lark, who was a partner of ours in Number 8 Ventures. And it's recharge, reconnect, reimagine. And for me, the first word in that is the most important. It's very lonely building companies out into the world, and the CEOs have all kinds of challenges to deal with, often trying to wrestle with them on their own without good support. When they come together and share, it's all about sharing, then they get a new bout of energy. And that for me is the essential, that coming to Morgo is your annual recharge. You should go away re-excited about being in business. We're totally business focused. So it's not a retreat with massages and spas and all that sort of thing. It's pretty high energy. So now calling it a high energy retreat because I haven't found better words for it. So that's important. And of course, people love meeting each other, and it is about learning as well as that getting new courage. So it's peer-to-peer learning. We don't do much teaching. We don't talk at. And it's not for startups because we're not a how-to. We don't say you do this and you do this. We say bring your experiences to Morgo and share them with other people. So you have to be underway enough to have experiences to put into the pool.
That's such an interesting insight about the loneliness of the CEO life, because they kind of act as like a fulcrum between the pressures of board and capital above them and then operation and staff and everything below them. And they're the single point where everything kind of converges pressure-wise.
Well, don't forget the pressures of the market.
Yes. Marketing competitors.
Markets can be brutal.
Yeah.
It's tough, and they will all have their tough stories. And also we don't invite investors to Morgo, which has been controversial over the years. And there was a great sort of standoff when the Angel Association wanted to move their conference next to Morgo and all come to Morgo. And I had to go, it's not for investors. And how could I put that nicely? And the reason is we don't want companies telling their glossy stories. We don't want them presenting their pitch deck. We want them genuinely sharing experiences. And we do. The blurry bit is we do have some investors at Morgo. I mean, we're never going to stop Sam Morgan coming to Morgo. He's one of the heroes of the tech sector. And we also have some people who are very active board directors, but they are part of the teams who are building these high growth companies. And while it's primarily CEOs, we also have a lot of CTOs, especially founder CTOs. So Vaughan comes often.
Vaughan Rousel from Venn, yeah.
Yeah.
Vaughan Ferguson from Venn.
Yeah,
yes.
now Vaughan Ferguson, which was pretty confusing. So we get a lot of we get CTOs. Then sometimes we get the CFO because the CFO wants to know why the CEO is spending money. So the CEO brings the CFO as well. So it's mostly CEOs, but other people who are very active in that senior team of building the business.
And were you surprised by the way that it grew and took on a life of its own and became something you couldn't stop doing?
Yeah, I was. I was really, but I love it, and it's a real community now, the Morgo community. And the stories that have been shared there are extraordinary. We could be here all day with me telling you Morgo stories. But let me just touch on that third word in the tagline, which is the reimagine. We started probably about 8 years ago. I went to one TED conference. So I went to one TED event, and I really enjoyed it. But it wasn't enough about business for me. I wanted to talk more about business. But the one thing I really loved was the science talks. And so I came back to New Zealand all fired up and said, we're going to have science talks at Morgo. And then my friend Helen Anderson was running the Ministry of Research, Science and Technology. And she already knew about Morgo. And I said, Helen, we're going to do science talks at Morgo. You're going to fund them. Anyway, she did. And we didn't really know where to go from that first sort of thought that we're going to do some exciting science talks. But so just tell you this is another story. But we asked Morst who they would like to invite, and somebody they were collaborating with. We didn't get anything from that, so we asked somebody at University of Auckland, if they had somebody they were collaborating with that we could bring in, and we didn't get anywhere with that. And we thought, whoa, we have to find the science speaker. So we were getting really close to Morgo. Maybe we were 6 weeks out. I remember this so clearly because I was actually driving on the LA freeways, and I did have a hands-free phone, I assure you. And I rang Sandra Lukey, who was helping me down in Christchurch, and said, hey, Sandra, it turns out we have to get the science speaker. And we're really late. So this is going to be west coast of US, that's it, not trying anything more complicated. And let's start with, there was this woman at TED, Catherine Moore, who talked about a history of surgery from 5000 BC to the current day, culminating in nanosurgical instruments. I said, she's on faculty at Stanford. See if you can get hold of her. So Sandra rang Stanford. Turns out at this stage, Catherine was only half a day a week at Stanford, got put straight through to her. And Catherine said, did you realise that I was born in Glenorchy? We had no idea. We thought she was American. And so she thought this was great. And she was our first science speaker. And she's now a world-class New Zealander. She's very reconnected to New Zealand. That's a segue, but we love it. There's so many Morgo stories.
That's so great. And with all those connections and all those, people sharing the journey and being in the same level, what kind of great meeting ups have you seen or people kind of going on to do things together?
Yeah, most of it we don't see. Sometimes we hear about it later, but I know at Morgo last year, somebody was recruited onto a board and people share fundraising ideas. Actual JVs, I can't really think of any. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff happens at Morgo.
Yeah, and you mentioned investment there. Tell us about that journey with Number 8, having kick-started venture capital here, got a fund through, and then the second fund headlong into the GFC.
Yeah, the GFC was really brutal for anybody in early stage ventures. I think we really felt there was 5 years where was very, very hard to raise money for pre-revenue or early stage companies. We managed to not lose any of our companies in that time, but it's hanging on by the fingernails. and we had one very supportive investor in the UK who did help us. So it's really just dipping into the same pockets again to keep things going. When we and there's other consequences of that. Boards get tired and you don't notice the change when it comes. So we were actually slow to pick up the improvement in the funding environment. We're all exhausted. But we did pick up, and within 18 months we listed three companies in 3 different jurisdictions. And then it was like, get out. So, we typically had to do a year of holding on to the shares before we could distribute them. But I'm really pleased to say that having gritted it out, and it was really hard going. The last 2 years I worked for no pay because there was we put the money into the companies. There was no money left. But we did actually give our investors a good return. And given that we'd had to slog it out for so long, we're pretty happy.
And so many of the same questions and things you were grappling with. You mentioned earlier the first kind of share purchase plan for a company. Still, that's very hard to do in New Zealand law. So many of the challenges that you've had over the years there, some of them are still here. But is the state of the industry better? Is the capital markets, are they working better here?
Well, I think the venture capital market in New Zealand is extremely disappointing. There's 2 funds currently operating, or maybe more, but very small. And we really don't have a venture capital industry. Australia does now, but we don't. We have angel funding, masses of it. So I think we've overdone. I mean, there's now some very sophisticated angel funding too, but I think we've overdone the angel funding level and completely underdone the serious capital that comes with advice and connections and ability to connect with offshore VC firms. That's the bit we're missing, the people who can do the Series A round for you. And I don't know why this has happened, whether it's the New Zealand DIY attitude, I build my own shed and I build my own venture portfolio. It's the same kind of thing. It's a outgrowth from, share clubs or something. But I think that is holding our companies back. And now seeing more and more companies going offshore for that Series A. And often, unfortunately, that means that we lose the CEOs to live overseas, and we lose then important part of the company. And I think companies can be built anywhere, and you will have to spend a lot of time in market. But the market that's determining the location of a lot of our company headquarters now is the funding market. It's not the customer market.
Having been through the journey with a lot of these companies, what's the advice that you give to entrepreneurs?
I heard Melanie Perkins from Canva answer this question recently, and I thought her answer was fantastic. She said, I'm actually glad I didn't know anything because I don't think I'd have done it. And so, everybody faces new challenges. So actually putting it together with another piece of advice that I heard from a British entrepreneur a couple of weeks ago, he said, you just have to get out of bed every morning and go do it. There is just no substitute for doing. And of course, you should network and get useful people who can help you. You should learn from everybody, and you should test off one bit of advice against another, because you will be given plenty of bad advice as well as good advice. So, all advice is not equal. So, I think really the number one thing is just do it.
And how do you define success? What's your version of success?
I think success is very personal, and it's what you want to do. I think people who build great companies are usually driven by what they're building for the world, not by money, and the money comes as a consequence of making the best product, or it's not usually about product, but actually getting something into the market and seeing it make a difference. That's what's driving most people. But it could be different things, People might have another goal, and I think it's important to reassess that along the way too. I just had one of those conversations in the last week with one of these CEOs who's up in the US fundraising, and he was worried that that he might want to sell in 3 years, and the VCs he's talking to might want him to keep going for up to 10 years, and that's a misalignment, And I was kind of counselling him. You do a lot of counselling in this venture capital business, and saying, well, you've really got to work out what you're doing with your life, and where you want to be, and do you want to do you want to get quit of this business to do another business, or is this the big one? Are you going to build this one? On and on. You got to ask yourself those things all the time.
And for you, how do you define your success?
Well, what I'm doing now is I want to do things I enjoy doing. And I've done too many things that I haven't enjoyed doing. I must say, working for investors is pretty thankless. Having given our investors a good return in that fund that we dragged through the GFC, not one said thank you. So you think, why am I doing this? Why am I working for these people? I want to work with people I enjoy working with. And so you get back to Morgo, and I just love it. So it's not about making money. It's about, for me, Morgo is about making a difference for some of these people. And when I see people go away with new energy, new enthusiasm, that was it. That was what I did it for.
That's magic. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jenny Morel. If people are interested in Morgo, if they're in the senior ranks of big, high growth and interesting companies, how do they go about getting involved?
Well, just go to the website, and there's a form there to fill out. We want to know when people apply to join the Morgo community. We don't just want their name and email address. We want to know what their company does and what they do and why they think that makes it a Morgo company.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you very much to Tina Tiller for producing, and thank you very much for having us along in your ears. Cheers.
You've been listening to Business is Boring, presented by Simon Pound, and brought to you by the Spinoff and Callaghan Innovation.
From the Spinoff Podcast Network, that was Business is Boring, brought to you by SparkLab. Make sure you're following Business is Boring wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information on SparkLab, visit sparklab.co.nz. Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spinoff Podcast Network.